Good morning, everybody. My name is John Hamry, and I'm the president here at CSIS. A lot of times we have conferences with defense guys, and I don't worry about starting late with them, but I can't afford your billing hours. So we got to get going here. You know, you guys are at the top of your game. We're delighted to have you here. This is the first time that CSIS has hosted Leadership IP here in Washington. I've participated in your conferences the last couple of years, but this is the first time that you're here, and that's because in a conversation with Kirti Gupta over the last year or so, because she decided to leave Qualcomm, wanted to keep this community going, and it is a community, I think. That's the most important thing. She asked if CSIS would be an administrative base for leadership. And I said, yeah, very much so. I've been on the most remarkable intellectual journey these last 3 years. It started when Walt Kopan came. He called me, and we'd gone out to, I'd taken a couple of my guys out to NIST, and that's when I first met Walt. And it was just opening up a horizon that I didn't have any real consciousness about. And so for the last 3 years, this has been a remarkable journey for me. You know, I've been in Washington for 45 years and pretty much a defense guy, you know. But it was my first opportunity to see one of these real foundations of what's been the success for America through the years. And it's been this innovation economy that's been created because we took important steps to protect people's intellectual property as part of that. And so when I met Kirti and participated in the Leadership IP sessions, I started to realize how really important this is. And it's a giant debate that's only understood by a very small group of people. But there have been these raging things going on. I mean, we've had march-in rights debate, you know? I mean, this is churning around. You all, it's very familiar to you. It's amazing how many times when I explain to people what it is, it's just like a light bulb comes on. I just have never heard of it before. And of course, we had the TRIPS waiver, which was a big battle. We had standard essential patents that became a big battle. These are now issues that I've come to realize are profoundly grounded in America's future productivity and success and prosperity and ultimately national security. Because the real foundation of national security, it's not guns and aircraft carriers and stuff like that. It's the vitality of your economy. It's the strength of your creative industry. And so this is really important, and we're really proud to have this affiliation with Leadership IP. But I'm only an ornamental feature on your conference today. So where's Kirti? Kirti Gupta is going to get us really started. Kirti, here she is. Welcome, Kirti Gupta, the real leader of this thing.
Thank you, Dr. Hamry, for giving leadership a home at CSIS at a time where it's really important we bring the community that works on innovation and intellectual property in our nation, which is a lot of you in the room. I think it's a unique community, along with national security and economic competitiveness nexus. I think the timing is exactly right. So we are really thrilled to have this new home at CSIS. And from here, this is the beginning of this new chapter of leadership and this community where it can come together and evolve with CSIS. So we have a day's program that reflects that. We talk about a number of things today that affect US firms' competitiveness because, frankly, national competitiveness today is the competitiveness of our firms and of our thriving private sector where a lot of R&D comes from, along with the public-private partnership. And we are looking at global developments, not just national developments in the IP innovation space to think about how they affect our industries and what we should be doing vis-a-vis an innovation policy in the United States. That's kind of what the day's program reflects. We have an excellent lineup. And what I would like to suggest, because I see so many experts in the room in this field, in your own right, I would love to have a day where we can really come together, participate, discuss, have an active discussion. You know, leadership tagline says, discuss, debate, unite, lead. It's not written there, but it's somewhere. But that's the spirit, really, of bringing everybody together. I do want to say a couple of other programming things for your awareness. The event is being live streamed at the CSIS website. We will also have proceedings of the conference run by Competition Policy International, CPI. They have a desk right there. Sam Sadden, who's the editor, is sitting somewhere in the room. There's Sam. So if you're interested in a related topic at the intersection of innovation, national security, please speak with Sam. Let him know your interest. And with that, I would love to start the day. Very quickly, the program is in front of you. And we have panels through the day that have a certain narrative arc. We are starting the day with thinking about what are the different initiatives today that are affecting US industries' competitiveness. I think Dr. Hamry mentioned margin rights, he mentioned standard essential patents. There are different other IP policy initiatives we should be thinking about. And Walt Copan is leading that panel. We're going to move on to, well, we're in 2024, so we can't not talk about AI. But there is a lot happening at the intersection of IP and AI. We'll have a panel on that. After lunch, we'll move on to a discussion about call to action. What does or what should a comprehensive innovation policy look like? What are the current initiatives on the table and how we pull them together? And then we have Dr. Hamry on a panel with, it's more like a fireside chat with two other national security experts and innovation experts to really talk about that nexus at the end of the day. So I would love to have a call to action at the end of the day with this group and think about what the next steps for this community should be. So as you sit through the day and participate in the program, please keep in mind what your thoughts are about how to make this discussion an actionable plan. And we would love to circle back on that in the end. With that, enjoy the day. And Walt, I would love to invite you up on the stage. Thank you.
Kirti, thank you so much. Dr. Hamry, thank you for your kind opening remarks. I'd now like to invite our first panel to come up onto the stage. Make yourselves comfortable, and we'll just get ready to begin momentarily. I'm delighted to have our terrific first panel, Professor Jonathan Barnett, Patrick Kilbride, Gillian Fenton, and Fabian Gonell joining with us here on stage. All right. Great, thanks. So let me begin with just a few introductions to our panel and then a couple of thoughts of framing this part of the conversation today. Jonathan Barnett, who's just been seated, is the Torrey Welch Professor of Law at the University of Southern California School of Law. He's the author of many publications, including Innovators, Firms, and Markets, the Organizational Logic of Intellectual Property. He's published very, very widely on issues related to antitrust, intellectual property law, and policy. There's a new book coming out that Jonathan is editing, called 5G and Beyond, Intellectual Property and Competition Policy in the Internet of Things. Very much looking forward to that latest of your works, Jonathan. And with our panel today, we will have I think, some interesting opportunities to have conversations about the future of the high-tech sector, antitrust, the role of intellectual property, and standard essential patents. Next, Patrick Kilbride on stage right is the Senior Vice President of the Global Intellectual Property Policy Center, at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, GIPC for short. Patrick served in the Chamber's International Division prior as head of the Americas Policy Team. He was founder of the Coalition for the Rule of Law in Global Markets efforts. Before joining the Chamber, he was Deputy Assistant USTR for Public Liaison in the George W. Bush administration. Patrick, we're delighted to have you with us in the conversation today. Next, Gillian Fenton, here, stage left, is presently Special Counsel for Innovation and Government Collaborations at GSK, the global pharmaceutical biopharma company, where her practice supports GSK's vaccine pipeline and platform technologies. Prior to that, Gillian was Vice President, Associate General Counsel, and Chief IP Counsel at Emergent Biosolutions. She has been a member also of the Licensing Executive Society since 1992 and served as the Society President from 2020 to 2021. Very much focused on intellectual property commerce, and especially in the life sciences sector. Gillian, thanks for joining us this morning. And then Fabian Gonell. Fabian is Senior Vice President, Licensing Strategy and Legal Counsel of Qualcomm's Technology Licensing Division. His responsibilities include developing the company's licensing strategy, negotiating licensing agreements, and overseeing the company's compliance with the rules of standards organizations. Prior to Fabian's joining Qualcomm, he was litigator at Kravis, Swaine & Moore, LLP in New York, and served also as adjunct professor at the Fordham University School of Law. So, awesome panel. Once again, thank you each for joining with us today. I'm just going to have a seat with this august group. And just a few comments as we get going. We've heard from Dr. Hamre the essential linkage between economic security, economic vitality, and innovation with national security interests. The U.S. has long been recognized as the global innovation leader by many, many measures, including intellectual property filings, the value of intellectual property commerce itself through license transactions within nation and also globally. And we have seen important policy changes in the United States over the past years that represent a sea change of focus on the future of U.S. innovation leadership. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act all include important provisions to drive innovation and in particular to incentivize innovation investment. At the same time, we've seen policy changes, policy proposals that actually have a risk associated with them, a risk of actually undermining these leadership positions with regard to U.S. innovation, and our panel will be unpacking many of those challenges with us today. And hearkening back to Kirti Gupta's comments, what should the innovation community within the United States do? How should we respond? How should we interact with policymakers? What is the education that's necessary to provide clarity? Dr. Hamre mentioned in his opening remarks that the community that actually understands the intricacies of these issues is relatively small in the United States and also internationally. And so it's important for this community then to have an amplified voice in sharing the implications and then working on policy-driven solutions. The United States, together with other nations, participate in a private sector-led consensus standards process, and we're delighted that we have representatives of the standards community here with us today. The situation that we've seen is not just what appears to be a bifurcation in the standards landscape, but what almost looks like a trifurcation with the United States and many of its allied nations, the European Union, and its trade bloc and interests as a community in standards policy and leadership, together with the ascendance of China, and with China having exerted a very important voice globally with regard to intellectual property and the standards landscape. The role of standard essential patents, those intellectual properties that are required to actually bring a standard into practice globally, are in a very unique type of position because they are seen in some quarters as a tool that promotes antitrust types of behaviors for competitive advantage. China has exercised what are called anti-suit injunctions, and then there are multiple cascades of injunctive activities, with, interestingly, the Chinese policy being focused on controlling global market pricing through the action of anti-suit injunctions, specifically around standard essential patents. What an interesting time, too, when Huawei comes out with a series of statements with regard to what global pricing should be in the high-tech sector, and so de facto attempting to set prices globally for the high-tech innovation community. I believe that our panelists will be discussing some of these topics with us today. We're also at a time in the United States across market sectors where we have seen challenges with respect to our trained workforce, the availability of people who are prepared to take on the role of leadership in the economy of tomorrow. And this ranges from the advanced manufacturing sector. We've seen it in the critical materials space, where there is a dramatic gap between the number of people who are available for the workforce and what we're projecting for the future, as well as those who are actually being trained and prepared for careers in these sectors. And these trends cut across all sectors that are important for the technologies of tomorrow, including the future of quantum engineering, devices, quantum communications, and computing. These fields require, in many cases, specialized skills, as well as a labor force to support them of the skilled trades, where the United States currently has a substantial labor force gap. The US-EU Trade and Technology Council has been an important body that's established between the US and the European Commission around cooperation in critical and emerging technologies and looking at joint economic and security needs between the US and the EU. And that group is also part of the international debate about the future of standards, the role that standards and intellectual property will play, not only in our collaboration as trade partners, the role that we have jointly in supporting research and development in critical and emerging technologies, but also then looking at their implications for innovation and national security. So I was formerly the director at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and one of the initiatives that I had the privilege of leading was called the Return on Investment Initiative that brought together a national conversation around U.S. innovation, the role that the public sector, our universities, our research institutes would play the role that the federal government will play as well in supporting R&D, supporting the private sector, supporting the innovation process, technology transfer, the journey from the laboratory to the commercial marketplace. There were a series of legislative and regulatory proposals that came out of that work. Some of those are still pending. And so I'm pleased that the conversation is ongoing within the United States as we're looking at the critical role that the U.S. Universities play, but also the role that our federal research institutes play in the innovation landscape. It's interesting still that some of the legislation that underpins U.S. innovation through the Stevenson-Weidler Act has not been updated in over 3 decades, well before the digital economy and many of the issues that we're dealing with here today. And so as we look to the future and the future of the Stevenson-Weidler Act, it's important to keep in view that the federal government does have this critical catalytic role with regard to not only the funding that's provided, but the research that's carried out within these institutions and facilitating the transition of technologies from these public sector organizations to private sector innovators, to breaking down barriers to entrepreneurship and enabling these technologies to see the light of day, instead of, as we've seen in the days before the Bayh-Dole Act, still having these important technologies sitting on the shelves of the government. The administration has recently made a proposal in the beginning of December, a new framework under the Bayh-Dole Act, which is so important to U.S. innovation, enabling our universities, our research organizations to actually hold the intellectual property rights that arise from federally funded research, and in the public interest, to license those technologies to existing corporations, to new startup companies, and in so doing, supporting the innovation ecosystem. It is a time in the United States where there are concerns about the cost of healthcare, the costs of pharmaceuticals, and clearly the United States is the world leader with regard to biopharmaceutical innovation, but also the cost structure has now become a political lightning rod. And so we've seen action taken, including by my former agency, with regard to a new proposed framework on the government's ability to march in and to force the relicensing of intellectual properties that are in the hands then under the stewardship of a corporation. And with the debate being around the cost of products in the marketplace, including the special focus on biopharmaceuticals, to be able to exercise those march-in rights on certain conditions, to force that relicensing of intellectual property or convert an exclusive license to a non-exclusive license and thereby enable new competitors to enter in the marketplace after a licensee has been already successful. Those march-in rights, of course, have been established so that corporations would not just sit on technologies, that they would have a diligent process to bring them into the marketplace and to be able to demonstrate that diligence. But at this time, the focus on pricing and opening up the door to a new framework on march-in rights has created some substantial concerns because of the importance of clarity of intellectual property ownership driving the early stage investment in technologies by the corporate sector, by the venture capital and the seed and early stage investment community. So I'm confident that Gillian will have some comments, especially for our group, on the role that march-in rights play. But we're at a time quite clearly with these types of actions and also the proposed waiver under TRIPS to expand beyond the vaccine space in the WTO, that there's not a clear understanding by policymakers in the United States about the importance of the linkage between intellectual property, investment, and the journey of innovation, economic impact. And so how do we consider these issues? How do we provide insight to policymakers about the importance of these underpinnings? And then how do we drive the kind of change that would maintain the vitality of the United States within the global innovation ecosystem? So with those happy remarks, I really would like to turn it over to this wonderful panel. I've asked each of them to provide a few minutes to share their perspectives on the topic of the day, the linkage between national security and innovation, intellectual property, and international competitiveness. I'd like to start with the far right, to my right of this panel. Patrick Kilbride, GIPC, have a very broad perspective on what's going on within U.S. industry and innovation. Patrick, what thoughts would you share with this group?
Thank you, Director Copen. I never want to be in a room with the director without saying thank you for your leadership at NIST with unleashing American innovation. And really, you framed for all of us for years to come how we should be thinking about these opportunities for investment and innovation. And that work was so important. I want to thank Kirti Gupta and Chris Borges and the whole team here at CSIS for having us, for having me. This is really important. So when I think about national security, I always believe, especially in America, that it begins with economic dynamism and technological leadership. If any of you saw the IP principles document that the Chamber and several dozen co-signers released at the end of last year, national security was #1 on that list of the short list of real deliverables from our intellectual property system. Why is that? I think it plays into 5 things that we do well and really better than anyone else in the world. #1, we foster competition. And I don't mean antitrust, although that certainly plays a role. I mean creating the opportunity for many, many stakeholders throughout our economy to compete together on a level playing field. Second, we enable risk-taking and we encourage failure. Third, we provide and respect private property rights. Fourth, we make markets with those assets that are created through our respect for property rights. And fifth, we surround those assets and those markets with the rule of law. And we do these things better than anyone else. And when you take those 5 things and you combine them with our university system, with our federal research infrastructure, with our financial markets, including venture capital, private equity, all of the different elements that go into creating a versatile and liquid financial market, then you get an innovation ecosystem that is the envy of the world. And that ecosystem represents an enormous set of stakeholders in all sorts of different industries that spans a continuum on the innovation life cycle from education, so knowledge advancement, knowledge diffusion, technological development, technology transfer, technology diffusion, that is, as Walt said, spans that gamut from funding of early stage scientific research all the way through to the commercialization. And I hate that word commercialization because it sounds so commercial. I like to think in terms of realization of new technologies, products, and services that benefit everyone, right? And you get this robust ecosystem that in times of crisis, as Gillian knows better than any of us, can act quickly to provide real-time solutions to existential challenges, as we saw in the COVID pandemic, for instance, with the unprecedented development of vaccines and therapeutics in record time, building on decades of investment in intellectual property creation. So where does this take us? We need to foster this ecosystem, and the role of government, Walt said, early stage funder, catalyst. I couldn't agree more. I think that's a really important point, but also steward. I was in Chicago last week, week before, I don't know, for the Center for Intellectual Property Understanding, did their IP Awareness Summit. So I took the opportunity to quote Milton Friedman, of all people, who said, the role of government in business is to determine the rules, arbitrate, determine, arbitrate, and enforce the rules, which I thought was a remarkable statement from Milton Friedman, who we think of maybe not liking rules so much. But, we see that regulatory structure is an important part of making markets and enabling investment and fostering competition. Where we don't want to see is going overboard. I think carefully, and I'm a little concerned about the direction of industrial policy in the United States today. I think, we have a tendency, instead of focusing on those things that we're doing well, that we've done well, better than anyone else, maybe we're trying to beat the Chinese at their own game. We're never going to out-subsidize China. We're never going to, be better at grabbing resources by the neck and directing them in the direction we want. This is a market that's driven by economic reality, first of all, but also psychology, right? We're creating the conditions where private capital can be mobilized, where it can be shared. And it's our intellectual property system that enables the allocation of those scarce resources to risk-taking, and then helps people like Fabian to actually collaborate and share because of the legal certainty that we've built into our system. So when government, instead of approaching this ecosystem from the front end and saying we're going to create the condition, instead circles around and starts to intervene on the back end, then we have a problem. Then we're trying to do what China does far better than we do. That's not a winning formula. So I just want to conclude by saying, let's focus on what we do best. Not an industrial policy, but an industrial strategy that helps us to enable success, to mobilize resources, and to be the technological leader that provides security, not only for ourselves, but a global order that provides security for the world.
Great. Patrick, thanks so much for those framing comments. Fabian, over to you next. Really appreciate your being part of this, and also the role that Qualcomm plays in the global high-tech community and with products and technologies that are sold around the world, including those that are supported by standard essential patents. So Fabian, look forward to your remarks.
Oh, thank you, and thanks CSIS for hosting this event. We've already heard a lot about America's technological leadership and how critical it is to national security. And my point of view, and my remarks will be focused on standard essential patents and telecommunications, because that's where my expertise is. And to me, it's been a remarkable development to see, both in Europe and in some voices in the United States, a suggestion of the West surrendering technological leadership. And what do I mean by that? So in the debates in Europe, in Parliament, over the standard essential patent regulation, some members of Parliament stood up and asserted that devaluing intellectual property is good for Europe, because Europe is a net taker of intellectual property and not a developer of intellectual property. And I don't buy into that at all as a premise, but even if that premise were true, seems to me that devaluing intellectual property is exactly the opposite way to go. You are then surrendering, saying we will forever be behind, is what you're saying, if you proceed down that path. And even in the United States, some of the submissions to the USPTO on standardization and on patents suggested, well, standard essential patents are owned a lot by Chinese companies and European companies, and only some by American companies. And so Commerce Department should really think about that factor and the interest of America being in lower royalties. Again, that is, well, as Michael Jordan said in that documentary, I took that personally. Because in telecommunications, we, the United States, has the most valuable patents in the world. We have led the world in technological development. And so the notion that the United States is behind, even, let alone should surrender and forever be behind is incredibly misguided and, as I said, personally offensive. The technological leadership has been born of and has developed from markets underpinned by a stable set of rules, the rule of law, that has led to the allocation of capital in such ways that sometimes has succeeded, sometimes has failed, but in the net aggregate has led to technological leadership, has led to the creation of companies and institutions that enable things like mobilization for a national emergency, that I'm sure we'll hear about. And devaluing that is basically sacrificing long-term national security, long-term competitiveness, long-term prosperity for some short-term, basically shifting of money from one pocket to another. So with that overview, let me talk a little bit more specifically about open standards and how they contribute to national security and competitiveness. Because we saw in the TTC was mentioned earlier today. There was a portion of the TTC that talked about 6G, the next generation of cellular standards, which is, of course, near and dear to my heart and my company's heart. And in that section, there was broad agreement between the United States and the European Union about the importance of technological leadership, the importance of open standards as both an engine for prosperity and an engine for security. So I wanted to just put a little finer point on that and discuss how open standards actually contribute to national security and tie those things together. Because really there's two primary ways. First, open standards create and enable an ecosystem that allows for innovation and allows for return on investment, both through licensing and through product sales of innovation that leads to greater innovation. That's the broad standards. Standardization is good for good economic policy. But it's also, something that perhaps is not as appreciated is that open standards enable a diversity of vendors that can be very important for critical infrastructure, can be very important for national security, so that you don't have one vendor or one country's vendors have control of critical infrastructure. And in a market, market competitive environment, which is basically what we have in the West, in a controlled economy, the government can dictate who wins the contracts, who buys, whose equipment gets installed. In a market-driven economy, right, individual actors make those decisions. And if you don't enable a lot of vendors to be potentially competitive, then they won't have a choice, and by default, it'll end up being one country's vendors or one set of vendors. And if one country starts to subsidize its vendors, it becomes even more of a short-term versus long-term issue. And in the short term, people are going to make rational economic choices, and you'll end up with national security issues because of rational economic choices. Open standards give a way out of that. If standards truly open and there's ways for vendors to come in, then you can create an ecosystem that enables choice. And stable IPR rules are essential to open standards, are essential to markets, are essential to allocation of investment. And that's, the stability is really, to me, what's the greatest risk right now. I see in our company, in our own industry, people are starting to think about, well, what do we do about our 6G investments or our investment in standards, given the growing uncertainty about government regulation of IPR rates? Yeah. What do we do about that? And there's there's choices from more proprietary solutions to different ways of doing standardization to other things. But there's going to be an effect. Industry does react. It might take a long time, but industry does react to changes. And industry does not like instability. Instability in the underpinning rules deters investment because it adds risk. And it adds risk to an already risky endeavor. So, so not to take too much time, I'm going to end on an optimistic note. And that is, in this room we have, as you've said, the kind of core experts in the field. And it is incumbent on us to help educate policymakers. And a lot of this, to me, is a choice between a short-term and a long-term view. In the short term, right, people might say, oh yeah, no, if we lower IPR rates or if we make certain drugs more widely available, lowering the drug rates, well then that'll be good because more people right now will get these things, right? Okay, but that's basically borrowing from the future to give benefits now, right? And we know that, and people in the field know that, but policymakers don't know that by and large enough. And it's incumbent upon us to educate them. And the hopeful note I'll say is, I do think policymakers are open to that, and I do think policymakers, once you demonstrate that trade-off is being made, can and do make more sensible choices.
Great. Fabian, thanks so much for those really, really helpful insights. We'll come back to many of these topics. Jonathan, over to you. What thoughts would you share with this group?
Thanks very much, and I'd like to thank CSIS for the opportunity today to share some insights that I'd like to convey to you. What I'm going to try and do in my brief few minutes is to try and distill almost 2 decades of research into the economic history of the U.S. innovation and patent system and the globalization of that system around the world to deliver some policy insights that are actionable and relevant to things that are being discussed in D.C. today. And I'd like to start with a story that goes back to roughly the late 1970s, where 2 scientists at the University of California and Stanford University, Cohen and Boyer, made a breakthrough that has changed everyone's lives in the room and has expanded access to new healthcare technologies and treatments that would never have been possible previously, and that's the invention of recombinant DNA technology. Now, it just so happened that shortly after that discovery, Cohen and Boyer and the University of California decided to go for a patent on that technology. That was a pushing the envelope decision at the time. It went against academic norms, and it wasn't entirely clear that the invention was patentable. It also so happened that in the ensuing years, the late 1970s, the early 1980s, we get a convergence of far-sighted legislative and regulatory decisions in Washington that are among the most successful combinations of policy actions that have ever been taken in the innovation space. We have enjoyed the fruits of those decisions until this very day. Unfortunately, over roughly the past 2 decades or so, numerous branches of the federal government and policymakers have wrongly viewed some of these decisions as being erroneous and have sought to unravel them. What were those decisions? First of all, the USPTO decided to grant the patent. That wasn't obvious at the time. The European Patent Office pushed back against biotech patents, and their industry struggled to get started. U.S. biotech industry immediately flowered after the issuance of the Cohen-Boyer patent. In the early 1980s, we got the Bayh-Dole Act, which removed decades worth of limitations under which federal funding agencies had labored and complained about for decades that they were unable to translate taxpayer-funded basic research and get it out into products that actually can help patients. The second action was the Federal Courts Improvement Act, which established the Federal Circuit. And while it did not have this specific purpose, it so happened that the case law decisions that were issued by the Federal Circuit in the ensuing decade restored patent protection. We forget that from roughly the end of World War II until the innovation malaise, a common term in the 1970s, it was very difficult to enforce patents in this country. The Federal Circuit corrected that, and one of the main ways in which they corrected it, I would say the most important way, is that they restored the confidence that if you are a patent owner and you demonstrate before a federal court that the patent is valid, you defend the presumption of validity, and you show it's been infringed just like every other property right, you are entitled to an injunction which enables market negotiation of prices to take place, the making markets function that was just referred to. And those actions, the removal of limitations on the ability to patent federally funded research, the restoration of confidence in the ability to enforce patents, and the Chakrabarty decision right in the same time window in 1980, which interpreted patent protection broadly. It introduced stability to the patent system. These decisions and these actions were widely attacked in the thought leadership community at the time and for a decade or more afterwards. What were the fears? That there would be a patent thicket, that there would be an anti-commons, that innovation would get stalled inside transaction costs and litigation. Let's look at the biotech industry and let's let the facts settle the debate. What happened in the biotech industry? There was a flowering of innovation based on recombinant DNA technology and other inventions. The Stanford patent was licensed out to almost 500 firms. It resulted in over 2,500 FDA-approved therapies that are actually helping patients. We are often told to imagine in biotech, in biopharma, how the world would be better without patents because then everything would be cheaper. I would ask policymakers to think about a world without patents in which those over 500 therapies have not been realized, have not materialized. Why will they not materialize? For a very simple reason. Because capital will not invest in markets where property rights are insecure. There is no law of nature that requires that current levels of capital investment in biopharma or any other IP-dependent industry must stay where they are when patent protection is reduced or withdrawn. No, capital will flee from that market and we will have less innovation than we have today. What Stanford did with the Cohen-Boyer patent, they licensed it out to many different industries. Did this block access to knowledge as was commonly predicted? No, the exact opposite. It disseminated knowledge and it allowed a market in ideas to form. It allows prices to form. Let me emphasize for a moment how important this market-making function is, because we often think about patents as just being about incentives. They are about incentives, but that's only a T1. Let's look at T2 through Tn. What's happening? What's happening is the same thing that you know about happens in motor vehicles and real estate. Markets form, financing form, investment flows into that industry. What happened in biotech, and if I had more time, I could tell you stories about non-biotech industries, but the same thing happened over and over throughout the US and around the world in industries that were dependent on the US patent system. Not only do you get more innovation, but you get more small firm innovation. Innovation and entrepreneurship go together. This is a subtle point that is often overlooked. In increasing patent protection in biotech, and I can give you other industries if we want to speak later. Patents not only increase innovation, they lower entry barriers. How's that possible? Don't patents increase entry barriers? No, they lower entry barriers. The reason they do that is because they reduce the capital cost of entry. So I'm a biotech firm, I have a patent portfolio, I can secure VC funding, and now, just like Genentech, which was the first firm that was founded based on the Stanford license, I can partner with Eli Lilly. I get my patent in 1979 from the USPTO, and US patients have the first biotech FDA-approved synthetic insulin product from Genentech and Eli Lilly in 1982. That's how the patent system works. It's a holistic system. It's federally funded basic research. It's VC money. It's partnering, and the technology gets out there to the market. This is a system that works. This is a system that should be bolstered. And I was going to say more about the rest of the world, but I think I've run out of time. I'll just end with the following. While it was mostly symbolic, the TRIPS waiver sends a message that the US is no longer committed to that fundamental baseline of property rights protections. This is so important. The ability of the market, the ability of entrepreneurs, the ability of investors to rely on a simple baseline of property rights protections in this country and around the world are the essence of what has made this system work, and it has worked. I gave you an example from biotech, but we could talk about other industries. It has worked not only for the entrepreneur, not only for the investors who have earned returns on it, but it has also worked for the US healthcare community, the patient, the consumer at the end of the day. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you so much for those perspectives. And thinking back on the catalytic role of the Cohen-Boyer patent decision, the licensing framework that was put in place by Stanford. So I was in my early career days at a company called Lubrizol Corporation. We had a venture capital arm that I was part of called Lubrizol Enterprises Incorporated, and together with Kleiner Perkins as the lead, we were the first investors in Genentech when they got started. And why was that investment made? It was because of the intellectual property rights and because of the promise that that technology could be world-changing and could lead to value creation. Without that type of framework, without the promise of a return on investment opportunity, those decisions would never have been made. So thanks for sharing that insight. Now let's turn it over to Gillian Fenton for your perspectives on this issue, and I'm sure that you'll have more to expand on with regard to these seminal intellectual property deals such as the Cohen-Boyer patent.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Walt, and thank you, CSIS, for the opportunity. Please, audience members, be aware that the views I'm expressing today are my own, based on my professional experiences. They're not legal advice, nor do they necessarily align with the positions of GSK. In the course of my career, I've worked with people and companies across a broad spectrum of the bioeconomy, from academic scientists and tech transfer officers to startups and their investors, to growing and established biopharma companies. Today, I'd like to address some current issues and controversies from the life sciences perspective. As a general matter, I applaud our current administration for their efforts to focus on advancing innovative industries, and particularly for such actions as the executive order on biomanufacturing and legislative developments such as the Cancer Moonshot and the setup of ARPA-H. But some of these very same actions, although well-meaning, have aspects that are harmful to our leadership in innovation and the global bioeconomy. The biological sciences are inherently collaborative and international. Scientists do their best work when they are free to work on the best projects using the latest tools and technologies and to collaborate with expert partners of their choice. Our system of strong and predictable intellectual property rights supports brilliant advances by these scientists and engineers. The freedom to collaborate through licensing transactions between academia and the private sector and between private sector companies is also essential. We saw fantastic examples of this across a wide range of collaborations during the COVID pandemic, when scientists and companies raced to develop novel vaccines in record time. This effort relied directly on strong IP rights and a legal framework of license agreements between actors across a range of different countries. Indeed, Pfizer has presented on their COVID-19 vaccine supply chain, and it's a great example of a complex global supply network. It's increasingly typical of vaccines and biotherapeutics that their development and manufacture requires the flexibility of global relationships. Yet some of the current administration policies directly hamper these activities. One key area of concern is the Bayh-Dole Act's requirement that products based on federally funded patents be manufactured substantially on U.S. soil. The Act and its implementing regulations, having been passed over 40 years ago, are simplistic in defining the U.S. manufacturing requirement and the availability of waivers. It's no longer true, if it ever was, that manufacturing is something that takes place in a black box, in a single site, in a single facility. Nowadays, it requires a complex biomanufacturing facility, in fact, multiple facilities, to invest their expertise at a cost of $150 million or more per facility, and also the need to recruit and retain a high-functioning, highly skilled workforce to make this type of manufacturing happen. Bayh-Dole's preference for U.S. industry should be updated, or the current statute should be administered in a pragmatic way that recognizes the need for global supply chains. It should also incentivize manufacturers to position the necessary expertise in countries and regions that are of strategic interest to the U.S. Another aspect of Bayh-Dole that has been in the news lately is NIST's efforts to update how the Act's margin rights are interpreted. In 2021, NIST proposed a guideline that pricing should not be a basis for seeking margin. Then last year, NIST released draft guidelines proposing the opposite, that price could be a consideration for marching in. Clearly, both positions struck political nerves given the enormous number of comments that were received. As a lifelong biologics, intellectual property, and business lawyer, I feel strongly that no change should be made that upsets the stability and predictability of business activities that advance innovations that improve human health, among other worthy endeavors. First, do no harm. If people want to bring down drug prices, they should look at other mechanisms with a higher chance of achieving that objective and not at the expense of innovation. On a more positive note, I'm excited about future uses of artificial intelligence to advance all aspects of the bioeconomy, from disease surveillance to drug design and development to advanced manufacturing. However, the law has not kept up with the rapidly increasing value of data as an asset. Data is not a recognized form of intellectual property, despite its strategic value to all sorts of businesses, which forces us as lawyers to fall back on trade secret principles and contract protections. This is an area that's ripe for the development of new best practices, maybe even new standards. So the need is especially felt by biopharma companies where valuable data may arise from human clinical trials, health outcomes, and the like. Here again, the approach to policymaking should be based on the principle of first do no harm. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Gillian, and thanks to all of our panelists for both a few rays of sunshine in your commentary, but also an indication that we face certain environments of uncertainty and hence risk. So how are we seeing that U.S. corporations are addressing this environment of uncertainty both here and abroad with regard to intellectual property, standards, and innovation risks to maintain a position of global competitiveness. Patrick, let's start with you.
Sure, I'll take that one. I think it's a great question because what I see, rightly or wrongly, I see a lot more reliance than ever on trade secrets. And I see a dichotomy between the industries whose intellectual property tends to live in the product that's out there in the marketplace that's vulnerable, and the industries where the intellectual property may live behind firewalls in their technological platform that's never necessarily exposed to competitors or customers. In Gillian's space in the biopharma industry, that then is exacerbated by the requirement for those companies to file with the FDA for regulatory and marketing approval. They have to prove the safety and efficacy of their product. A compulsion that doesn't apply to many industries in the technology space. So what you see, and I hate the word incentive, I don't think it should apply to patents at all. A patent is not an incentive any more than your title to your house or your car is an incentive. Your patent is a documentation of your ownership, period. But sorry, I'll get off that horse. Where incentives and disincentives do come into play, however, is with our patent system. There are incentives to use the patent system, the requirement to file for prove the safety and efficacy of your product in the pharma industry. There are disincentives, likewise, to using the patent system for other industries. We have to create, when we think about our laws and regulations, create the incentives to use the system, because patent disclosure is a good thing. Trade secrets certainly have their role, but patent disclosure is a good thing. I'll also say, because Gillian made such an important point there about data. We talk about it as the new oil. Yeah. I think you need to expand and adopt that point. Know-how, skills, data, information, analysis, these are the new shale oil. We know they're there, but we haven't always been able to extract the value from them because we haven't recognized and protected them as assets. That's really one of the next frontiers for intellectual property, is to enable firms, individuals, to own those types of assets. And I think it's absolutely critical in an AI world where we risk, sort of being beholden to the owners and keepers of the AI, that we as individuals are able to retain ownership of intangible assets like our know-how, our skills, our data, our information flows, our analysis.
Great. Fabian, what are your thoughts? How are companies and any insights from the Qualcomm world with regard to addressing this environment of risk and uncertainty?
So I'd say from the point of view of companies operating in the SCP space and telecommunications, I think or other industries that may be, I'll say, targeted in a way that I'll explain in a second. I think one thing that we are very cognizant of, or one way we think about these issues is, in general, although patent rights, notion of intellectual property and patent rights, it has been criticized and in some sense under attack for decades, yep. Right? And will continue to be, and it's a worthy debate. I think it is generally accepted and understood that patent rights are critical to promoting innovation and to developing a robust economy. So patent rights as such are less under attack than specific sectors or types of patent rights that tend to be disfavored or that are easier targets for attack. So standard essential patents are one such. Basically biopharma patents where people can tell heart-wrenching stories about people's health are another way. And one thing we see with specific regulations targeted at those types of patents, either through application of margin rights or through specific regulations, attempts to control the prices of those are something that we're very aware of, and that we see as targeted towards specific sectors. And so there's a couple of ways companies approach that. One is, well, is there a way to basically fall back on all patent rights? We want to take our patents out of this category, and that's under attack, and have them be enforceable as regular patents that are less under attack, right? So for standard essential patents, that is an option, right? Because we don't have to give FRAND commitments or do standardization necessarily, right? I think for biopharma, it's different because the categorization is different. But I do think it points to, I think companies that take a long-term view will be pointed to resisting, not just in our own space, but also in spaces like pharma that we're not in, the notion that some patents need to be devalued for these societal things. Right. Because once you start taking chinks out of the patent system, you start distorting incentives, and you start setting precedents.
Yeah.
Right? Like Professor Barnett said, the TRIPS waiver did not so much have a dramatic effect itself, but the precedent it set was destabilizing. How destabilizing it's going to be is kind of going to depend, like when will it next be used? Is it actually going to be seen as a one-off for this incredible emergency, or is it now going to be seen as a tool in the toolbox for people wanting to do certain outcomes? Yeah. So that's how we think about it. We react to this by defending patent rights, but also trying to fall back on them if we can, because we think there's less of attack broadly on patents and more an attack on specific types of patents.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting perspective, because there have been overtures made with regard to climate change mitigation technologies, right? That back to the other argument that no intellectual property rights should be enforceable within these areas, because the globe is trying to wrestle with climate change, and mitigation technologies should be freely available. And then the argument comes around, well, why should any company then make the risk investment in a technology that's not yet been proven, only to open the door for every other competitor and not be able to ultimately achieve returns for their stakeholders. A very, very interesting point. And I think it's an important one for this community as well to see intellectual property rights as a class that apply to innovation enablement across sectors. Jonathan, comments from you on this situation and this environment of risk and uncertainty. What are you seeing that companies are doing to respond, to maintain a competitive position?
Yeah, I'd like to respond by building off of Patrick's observation that we see greater use of trade secrecy-based strategies in some tech industries. As someone who's studied innovation policies both in the US and elsewhere, that response is not at all surprising. In fact, you can find many historical examples. I could talk to you about Switzerland in the late 19th century. I can talk to you about US tech during the post-war decades. There's a pretty consistent pattern. The way that industry responds when the patent system or other IP equivalents become more difficult to enforce in court is either capital will flee from that market towards other sectors where returns are higher, or they will shift to non-IP based strategies in order to capture returns. Now, that second observation is often relied upon by skeptics of the patent system as evidence to show that the patent system is unnecessary. But that conclusion is usually not well-founded, because that alternative non-IP-based strategy gives rise to other social costs that wouldn't otherwise have existed. Let me illustrate this for you with an example. During that multi-decade period where patents became very difficult to enforce, in the US, Did innovation collapse in the United States? No, it did not. But where did it take place? It took place through heavily government-funded private entities such as Bell Labs, GE Labs, DuPont Labs. The percentage of business R&D between 1957, which is when NSF started collecting this data, through 1980, that can be attributed to small firms, firms with 1,000 or less employees, 5%, holds like that throughout that period. As soon as the patent system is restored, by 2006, roughly 1/4 of business R&D is being done by small firms. That's the cost of weakening the patent system. You distort firms' business strategy choice set. They go to trade secrecy, and what do? You get innovation inside the walled garden. You've raised entry barriers, you have hurt entrepreneurship. And so, can firms in some industries outside pharma adapt to a weaker IP system? Some of them can, but they tend to be firms that are larger. They tend to be firms that are incumbents in the industry. With a stronger patent system, you allow the market to choose the business strategy that fits, which will differ in many different ways in response to many different factors.
Yeah, great. Gillian, any comments on this issue?
Yeah, thank you. I'm definitely aligned with the other panelists on the idea that a weaker patent system forces us more to fall back on trade secret protection, which is, also something that is difficult to communicate and to build a culture around within a large company, especially where you're dealing with a strong scientific workforce who've been raised academically on the principle of publication and developing their reputations. I'd also like to say another distortion that takes place when there are weak patent rights is really the situation that is to be addressed by PARA, the Patent Eligibility Restoration Act. Mm-hmm. In recent years, we've seen a strong erosion of value from the U.S. Medical diagnostics industry and other areas of technology innovation that rely similarly on capitalizing on natural relationships. But I think medical diagnostics is an area where the U.S. has really sadly fallen behind, and that situation could be rectified by passage of a new law such as PARA.
No, thanks for those perspectives. Audience, we're going to be opening up to questions here within just a moment, so think about what you'd like to ask. We'll have a microphone available. I'd like to ask our distinguished panel here today, as we're looking at the global realities with respect to intellectual property and standards policy. And we talked about the unique position that the European Union is playing, as well as China. Many corporations with a U.S. Base of operation are global players. Within this sort of geopolitical landscape, but in particular with regard to intellectual property and standards policies, what are companies doing about this? How are we looking at standard essential patents, intellectual property rights enforcement globally, and adapting? What are the strategic implications for U.S. operating firms? Patrick, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So the Chamber, some of you may be familiar with our our International IP Index, been published now for 12 editions and benchmarks 55 countries, accounting for about 90% of global GDP against 50 discrete IP indicators, patents, copyrights, trade secrets, trademarks, et cetera. What we've seen on the whole is that countries are investing incrementally in building the national infrastructure to promote intellectual property creation and ownership at home. That's a great thing. At the same time, we see this political layer of rhetoric that promotes things like IP waivers, forced technology transfer measures, that promotes this mindset that intellectual property is a barrier as opposed to an enabler. And these two conflicting trends, I think, we don't know which way we'll go. Innovation is not inevitable. I think Fabian and Jonathan both made this point. You know, it can go away. And we see innovation everywhere in the world, but it happens on a sustainable and a transformative basis where intellectual property laws are enforced consistently and provide that, you know, strong legal certainty for investment. So we're optimistic, but concerned.
Yeah, Fabian, especially on the world of SEPs, you're seeing this clearly. What's being done?
Well, in the SEP world, we are at a crossroads. And in some ways, it mirrors a kind of geopolitical crossroads of the question of, is there going to be a decoupling of the West and China economically or not? And standards, is there going to be a fracturing of what has become a global standards ecosystem to regional standards? You know, we think that would be a step backwards. We think that generally that decoupling generally is not in the interest of either the United States or China, and we think that fracturing of the standard system is certainly not in the interest of everyone. If you have, so how does that relate to IP? For the standard system, if you have different IP rules or IP rules that are that different from each other, then you will have decoupling because the incentives for capital allocation for investment are going to end up being different. I think people generally understand this because the IP rules end up being just kind of part of the background rules of trade, just like the enforceability of contracts rules are. And you see, what we hope is that countries see it is in their interest to have stable rules that encourage investment, that are harmonious, not necessarily identical, but harmonious with the rules around the world. Because you see contract law is not identical, but harmonious around the world. The contracts are generally enforceable around the world. Yes, there are odd decisions, but there are US court decisions too. Let's not kid ourselves, right? So you see that generally companies find enough certainty to operate contractually. And right now, in the SEPU space, there's enough certainty that people operate globally with some confidence that the results will be the same. We're working hard to make sure that remains the case, whereas others are working hard because they have greater traction on some ideas in some places than others in ways that will end up decoupling the system.
Yeah. Jonathan, Gillian, anything that you'd like to add?
Sure. So I'm going to take us back to 1995, which is TRIPS agreement. And it did something similar to that legislative cocktail that I talked about back in the 80s. It set a baseline of IP protection around the world. And Gillian talked about how complex the supply chains are in biopharma. If we look at semiconductors, it's the same thing. And what happens in both of them? Well, it's really complex if we went into the details, and I have some great diagrams I could show you. But the basic idea goes back to Adam Smith's pin factory. Because what happened in both of these tech-intensive industries, tech is not just about innovation, right? That chip that's in your Apple iPhone or Samsung, right? There's lots of components in there. What the market has done with that stable property rights baseline, rooted in TRIPS, rooted in bipartisan USTR commitment over and over, affirming TRIPS until recently. The market can then allocate every single function of that supply chain to the firm in the country that does it best. Consumer gets that phone as cheaply as can possibly be made within current technology. We talk a lot about, in Washington today, friendshoring on the manufacturing side in semiconductors. We already have friendshoring in place at the innovation levels of the chip supply chain with our like-minded allies in Asia in particular. Yeah. And those countries Taiwan, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Israel, these countries are reliant on a firm commitment to IP rights. Why? Because it enables the supply chain to disaggregate and allows information to be transmitted among all different players who are all best suited for that to happen. By reaffirming the strength of the US patent system, we not only preserve our own national security, but we preserve the security of an alliance of many other countries around the world who have a similar set of values to our own.
Thanks. Anything that you wanted to add?
Sure, yeah, I'll just very briefly say, I'd like to introduce the concept of a different type of standards. This is something that the Licensing Executive Society has been looking into developing in recent years, which is business process standards. If you think about it, how could we take a well-functioning market and make it work even more efficiently, be even more rapid response capable? And one of the ways that we can do that is to think about introducing voluntary standards for good stewardship of intellectual property. Think about all the time that gets wasted in investigating companies in terms of conducting due diligence before deals, and also the confidence that needs to be built up in having a company perform well in due diligence in presenting a very well-managed picture of its intellectual property. What if we could make that a little easier? I think if we were able to do that, you might see companies more customarily operating at the pace that they did during the COVID vaccine push.
Yeah. Thanks, Gillian, and really applaud the Licensing Executive Society for that important effort. Time for audience questions. Let's start here, please.
Hi, Bill Wichterman at Covington. First of all, let me just say how great it is that CSIS is hosting this, right? And it's now inside, because it's so appropriate that we be talking about the patent strength and national security and other things. So it's really great that you're doing it. Two quick questions. One for Jonathan. Riff a little bit more on the relative benefits of patents over trade secrets and what that means also for technological advance and international security. And I'd like you to get back on that horse you dismounted too quickly, Patrick, on the question of why patents, you said, are not an incentive, or that's not what they principally are. I'd love to hear that. Thank you.
And would you please introduce yourself as well?
Oh, Bill Wichterman with Covington, yeah.
Thank you so much.
So in general, why should we prefer that companies use patents or IP equivalent based strategies over trade secrets? Well, the answer is very simple, because it allows knowledge to get out into the market faster, right? Patent not only enables the innovator and the investors behind the innovator to earn a return on its innovation, it discloses information, it enables subsequent innovators to build upon those, right? So the patent only covers a fairly narrow range of knowledge territory. It discloses to competitors other areas, other entry points into the market. So everything else being equal, we prefer IP-based strategies as opposed to trade secrecy strategies, because Trade Secrets 101, everything has to be done in order to not allow that information to be made public, because, of course, then you lose the protection entirely. And that's why when we distort business strategy choices by weakening the IP system, even if we were able to maintain the same level of innovation, we're probably not in as good a place as we would be otherwise, because we're actually making it harder for other innovators to build upon that and to come into the market.
Great.
Thanks, Bill, for the question. I'll just say words matter. And in any space, policy space, academic space, whatever, we kind of tend over time to get a little lazy about words and use words that we all understand, but their literal meaning might conflict with what they actually convey, right? And incentive is one of those words. I remember Curdy was kind enough to invite me to speak at one of these leadership conferences when they were back at the at the museum a few years back, and I said at the time, 2 words I hate as a person who's relatively new to IP. One is reward, and the other is incentive with respect to the patent system. Why? Well, rewards are inherently retrospective and arbitrary. It's a recognition, something over and above, a bonus. A patent is not in any respect a reward or a bonus. It's a recognition of value added in the economy. Nor is it an incentive any more than your ability to own property that you invest in. You build a house, you buy land, you buy your car, you get a title to those things. It is not an incentive. Your incentive is to get to work, get to the grocery store in your car. So let's not confuse things. And I'll give you a real-world example here. AstraZeneca was recently, their case against the price controls and the Inflation Reduction Act was recently dismissed on question of standing. And the judge specifically pointed to their use of the word incentive and said that, you have no guarantee of being able to do future work that will provide you value. We don't guarantee that. And he tied that to the word incentive. I would say no. The injury to AstraZeneca was that the present value of their long-term investment in their innovation was devalued by the price controls in the IRA. And the word incentive specifically really did them harm.
Thank you for getting back onto that horse, Patrick. We have a question here, microphone. And please introduce yourself first and your question.
Hello, Robert Schmidt from the Small Business Technology Council. And my question is first for Professor Burnett and then anybody else who would like to comment. You mentioned that the number of patents from small businesses went from less than 5% before 1980 up to 25%. Just to add a little more to that, now the SBIR firms produce more patents than all the universities combined in most years. So it's these small firms that are really patents are us. But what my question is that in other fields, in education, we go from kindergarten all the way up to postdoc, and we have a bunch of steps in between. In baseball, we go from T-ball to minor leagues to major leagues, and we have all of these different steps. And the question is we see how the whole defense infrastructure has combined and collapsed over the last decades. We used to have many airplane manufacturers, now we have very few. And so there are fewer and fewer companies in this to be able to control, able to have this industrial base for defense. So, how do we encourage small businesses to grow and to be able to get steps for them to be able to grow in stages, which we currently really don't have. We have small and large, and that's about it. You got 500 employees or you don't. And so how do we get additional steps and other things to be able to grow this industrial base and make our country stronger in the next generation and all the subsequent generations?
So thank you for your question. Yeah, the story here, the policy story here is it's about innovation and it's about entrepreneurship. And that stat's exactly correct. It's 5% of business R&D when patents were weak were attributed to small firms, jumps up to roughly a quarter when patents are strengthened, suggesting that patents enabled accelerated small firm entry. And let's think about why that's the case. The reason that's the case is that with the patent portfolio in hand, the small firm is able to secure VC investment. It's able to partner safely with large corporations because it's protected to some extent from the large firm partner expropriating its technology. We see this, I use the biotech example because it's just the clearest example where there was such a drastic change in market structure. When the patent system were weak, you mostly had a handful of large integrated firms. In biotech, we know that's not the case. We have thousands of small firms who are partnering with large firms, sometimes vertically integrating all the way through. And I'm not an expert in some of the other policy areas you're touching on, but what I will say is that when we're talking about areas of high policy importance, defense, where I think we all recognize there's a lack of entrepreneurship, there's a disconnect between Silicon Valley and what DoD is looking for, climate tech, in general, if an area is of high policy importance and we want to leverage our entrepreneurship capacities, because many of the breakthrough innovations in U.S. tech industry, they don't come from the Apples or the Googles of the time. They come from Hewlett-Packard in the garage. Hewlett-Packard needs the patent system. So if we're talking about climate tech and that's importance, economic history, economic policy tells us we should strengthen the patent system. That's going to elicit capital. That's the fuel that the small business firm requires, whether we're in defense or in other areas.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Cal Goldman from Toronto, just flew in this morning. I appreciate the invitation from Curdy and others. Once again, I've been involved in leadership meetings going back to the Qualcomm days. Very interesting discussion on the panel this morning, informative, but I'm going to make a suggestion for this organization to consider going forward in the future. I'd like your reactions to this, that you bring a real international dimension, not just U.S. perspectives from U.S.-based folks. In Canada right now, and I can say this, I practice both competition law and foreign investment national security reviews. I'm also one of the vice chairs on the new ABA Foreign Investment and National Security Committee just set up because of the importance of the area. The vice chairs are from various countries around the world. Take a look at our Five Eyes situation. So I want to talk about technology. You can't do it excluding what's going on in the Five Eyes with China and elsewhere. Look at Canada next door. Right now, we have a major federal inquiry led by an appellate judge into election interference, primarily by examples from China and other countries. And they are really serious. As some politicians have said, if they interfered in one seat in Parliament, that's a threat to democracy, let alone a number of them. And they're using technology, and there's all kinds of evidence coming out there. There are other issues with Huawei, TikTok, use of technology, cutting across the Five Eyes. And I wanted to suggest to you to please consider going forward a broader perspective, because some of the issues are very serious.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much for those great points. And a number of our comments have certainly discussed the global implications and partner nations to the United States, and very, very well taken. We're nearly at the end of our scheduled time, and so we're going to go to a quick lightning round. And so I'd just like to ask each of our distinguished panelists for a few comments in closing, starting, Patrick, with you.
Sure. So two quick points. One, in response to the comment that's made, and I think there's always value in having an international viewpoint. However, I will say, when I started at GIPC, my focus was international advocacy. Today, it's domestic IP advocacy. We have to get the ship right at home, and then we can worry about the rest of the world, or we will never be competitive, we'll never be technological leaders. The broader point I want to finish with, I think everyone in this room understands and appreciates the wisdom of David Ricardo and his point about the invisible hand of the market. But I'd like to offer a counterpoint to that. Everybody, please put your hands up. Come on, bear with me. Everybody, hands up. We and 8 billion of our closest friends and family around the world, we are the market. Very visible hands, making choices every day. That is the power of the markets, it's the power of the U.S. economy. And when we allow political elites to substitute themselves for that decision making, then instead of billions of people making smart choices about their own lives, you have a few people making choices that necessarily limits the wisdom, the collective wisdom that we can bring.
Great. Patrick. Fabian?
So I'm going to focus my closing remarks on kind of the question about small business and some thoughts about that. And again, I'll focus on kind of the standardization space. And one thing, standards markets that are global, right, basically lend themselves towards big players, right? And innovation wants to be big. But does that mean there's no room for startups, no room for innovators? There is, when there's robust patent rights, and therefore the inventions that they come up with can be monetized and can have a return on investment. So in the 4G space, there's a company called Flarion, which was a startup in New Jersey, that developed some really, really good technology that was very useful for cellular standards. And they were able to patent it, and their patents were quite good. Qualcomm ended up acquiring them, and I think that was a good outcome. They didn't grow up to be a big company themselves, but the investors got a return on investment. Some of the employees became employees of Qualcomm, and that in itself can then start a virtuous cycle, because not all of those employees stayed at Qualcomm. Some of them left and started other ventures. And you see that now in AI, the AI space too, right, where people are leaving Google and starting their own companies, right? So long as there is a pipeline for a baseline of rules that will promise a return, then people will invest capital, seek capital, and start new ventures. And some of them will grow up to be big companies. Some of them will be acquired. Some of them may be mid-sized companies for a while on the way to being big companies, or maybe mid-sized companies and be happy. But the point is, all those companies have to start somewhere. And if you don't have a robust patent system, if you devalue patents, what you end up with is the big players that can already afford innovation, that have different ways to protect it through trade secrets and other things. They will more dominate the space and will lose the dynamism of new entrants.
Yeah, thank you. Our panel is focused on innovation and competitiveness, and I think these things go together. The competitive advantage of the U.S. economy and the economy of its like-minded allies around the world is the ability to innovate. American innovation over the past decades has outshined every other country, and part of that has to do with a holistic innovation ecosystem where basic research is funded by the federal government. The federal government has an important role to play in doing that. The market cannot replicate it. But the government is no good at commercializing, at cultivating those technologies. Legislation such as the Bayh-Dole Act and all of the other policy actions around that are a successful combination, and they are one that should be preserved and bolstered, not just in the biotech area, but in other areas of the U.S. tech economy. That's good not just for the U.S., that's good for our allies around the world who ultimately rely on that system as well.
Closing remarks, Gillian.
Great, thanks. I'd like to revisit the idea of an international approach and weave in the idea of data and data as an asset. Following the world of emerging infectious diseases is a really humbling and fascinating and salutary endeavor. This is an area where we need to be open to international collaborations and global efforts to collect data and to parse through it to determine what it means, because of course a new disease threat that arises anywhere has the potential to affect all of us everywhere.
Great, thank you so much. What a terrific panel. Thank you for your insights. I know that there's going to be a lot of conversation around these tables here today. Let's thank our distinguished panel.
All right, welcome back, everyone. This is our panel at the intersection of artificial intelligence and intellectual property. And as you all know, artificial intelligence has been around for some time. But really the world changed on November 30th of 2022 when OpenAI introduced ChatGPT to the world, and the rest is history. It had 100 million users within a month. It's one of the most fastest adopted technology platforms, and that really brought generative AI at the forefront. And a lot of the issues that we are seeing at the intersection of artificial intelligence and patents, copyrights, AI issues, IP issues, are focused around Gen AI. So, we're going to be focusing our conversation on those. And it's really important to be talking about this technology and other emerging technologies like we have been, because, we're at CSIS, we are talking about technology leadership in critical emerging technologies, and nothing more important than AI, which has changed our world, leveled the playing field for defense, national security, and other technology leadership purposes. So with that, I'm really thrilled to introduce this perfect panel of experts to be exploring this. I'll say why in a minute as I introduce all of them. So on my right is Dr. Lynn Parker. She's the Associate Vice Chancellor at the University of Tennessee and the Director of the AI Tennessee Initiative. And prior to this role, she led the national AI policy efforts from 2018 to 22 in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, serving as the Deputy Technology Officer of the US and founding director of the National AI Initiative Office. She's been at the UT faculty since 2002. So when we talk about the technology issues, I'm really happy to have Dr. Parker on our panel with us. And then we have my old friend, Rama Eluru, sitting next to her. She's a senior director at the Special Competitive Studies Project, SCSP. It's a nonprofit based here in DC, established to make recommendations to strengthen America's long-term competitiveness for future of AI and other emerging technologies that reshape our national security and economy. And before SCSP, she was the director at the National Security Commission on AI, which is when we met, I think. And before that, she was an administrative patent judge on the Patent Trial and Appeal Board at the USPTO. And then we have Phil Hill, who is a special counsel at Covington. And he focuses on complex copyright matters with an emphasis on music, film, TV, video games, sports, technology. And he's been representing clients in federal and state court and before US Copyright Royalty Board, Copyright, Patent and Trademark Office, etc. So he's been regularly advising clients on cutting-edge topics like Gen AI, metaverse, NFTs. So he can give us a really good landscape on the current litigation in the patent copyright space in AI. So with that, I think we would jump straight into the conversation in this panel, and then we'll invite participation from all of you. So I thought it's the one way we can kick this off, because we have Dr. Parker on our panel with us, is to ask you the first basic question: why here, why now? Why is the AI revolution here today? Why is it here now? And where are we headed?
Well, I think most of the people in the audience are aware that AI, of course, is not new. It didn't just show up about 2 or 3 years ago, but it has been around since the 50s. I think what is different now is that we've digitized the world. We've also created computers that are extraordinarily powerful and also at our fingertips. And so many organizations can have access to that computational power. And the algorithms that have been around for decades have now been tailored to that situation where we have lots of data digitized about almost every aspect of the world, and we have that computation that's broadly available. So what does that mean? So I started working in the White House about, it was August of 2018. And at that time, it was extraordinarily rare for the term artificial intelligence to ever show up, say, on the national media, on a news station, for instance. It would almost never happen. And then in no time, it started growing. And so that was pre-generative AI in the in the sense of these tools now being freely available. And so what was beginning to happen around 2018, 2019, 2020 is that the digitized world with those algorithms and the computation, the capabilities of AI systems to do things like recognition and language processing and so many other kinds of tasks was beginning to exceed the capability of people. This was true even before ChatGPT was released. And so in the sense that it's surpassing the ability of people to do things like image recognition, language processing, and so forth, that meant that industry was beginning to adopt it. And so we saw that adoption happening around 2018, 2019, 2020. And that was when people began to recognize not only the power of AI to very much create new capabilities, address important challenges across the board, but also some of the early potential harms were beginning to be recognized. If you go back to around 2018, for instance, there was a famous example where Amazon was using AI to help screen resumes because they had so many and they wanted to find the ideal candidates to come and work at Amazon. And so they used AI. Well, lo and behold, the AI detected a pattern in the data, which was that, well, apparently to be successful in a technology company, you need to be male, because most were. And so therefore it screened out all the women and just presented, mostly the male resumes. Well, it's not because the AI was designed to be intentionally biased, but it was perpetuating a pattern that already existed in the data, which is that most people that work in technology companies apparently are male. And so that began a conversation around, okay, AI is very powerful, it can do lots of great things, but what are the implications of AI and things like the kind of data that you're using to train it? Can it perpetuate biases? And so that's when the conversation around regulation really began to take root. And then a lot of conversations about, how, and still today, how do we address the issues that underlie the data that's fed into these AI systems so that we can make sure that it's representative of the use cases, that it's not perpetuating harmful biases and so forth. And then that led into a recognition of a number of other challenges around AI, which is that, well, how do we even understand what's happening? It's a little bit kind of black box. And so we say, well, let's be transparent about using it, or let's have it explain what it's doing. And that way we can more easily pick up on some of these potential harms. But then we recognize it's not so easy to do that from a technology perspective. And so DARPA, for instance, began investing in next generation AI, where you can have more transparent and explainable AI systems. And that still is a challenge for today. So then you just kind of fast forward 3 years or so, and then that's when the generative AI tools sort of hit the market, hit the internet, and now because they're freely available, tools like ChatGPT and Gemini and others, that has now very much opened up the possibility of using these kinds of technologies in ways that previously had not even been imagined. And it's really ratcheted up, again, the power of these tools to do things that humans are often not very good at. And so now you again have this, the power, the potential for innovation in so many different ways. Like, for instance, democratizing creativity, in the sense that you may not be very good at creating that marketing brochure that your boss told you need to create by tomorrow, but ChatGPT or Gemini or one of these tools can give you a good starting point, and then you can work from that to move forward. So lots of applications like that of how these tools can be useful. At the same time, now we're seeing yet another kind of concern, which is, well, how are these systems being trained? And what is the material that is going into these systems? And so that kind of brings us to the topics of today, which is these large language models, these generative AI systems are being trained on information that's available by and large just on the internet. Effectively, it's reading the internet and using that to train. And so then that leads to the challenge of, well, how do we ensure that the owner of that data that's being used in these systems is being appropriately recognized, compensated, and they have consented for that. And that has now raised a lot of the copyright and patent challenges around what is the right way to think about this. And so I think that's certainly a lot of what our conversation will be about. But I think in terms of the trajectory of AI and why it's exploded onto the scene now is just very much because as these tools became more and more useful and you could do amazing things with them, that sort of practice with using the technologies uncovered a number of these potential harms, things like using copyrighted material in a way that people aren't sure if it's fair use or not, going back to the potential of the data itself, perpetuating biases. Another concern is around privacy. You know, already absent generative AI, our data is already being collected, say as you click through different pages on the internet, and that click trajectory might then tailor advertisements to you, and maybe you don't like the privacy implications of that. So there are a lot of these kinds of issues that arise, I think, largely from the data that's being used to train these systems. So that's kind of the lay of the land of where we are and how it came to be that these are the issues that we're grappling with.
And the big confluence of these three factors, compute, big data, and the transformer technology coming together, just unleashing.
Yes.
So, and by the way, panelists jump in with any additional points, but I was just gonna move from the 2 points that you noted that are related to artificial intelligence. Is one, creativity. So, you know, what does the new system of inventing and innovation look like with AI-assisted inventions? And the other one is of data. What are these data inputs? Whose data is it? What do we do about that? So maybe we start by unpacking that. So I'll move first to Rama and then to Phil just to talk a little bit about the question of AI-assisted invention. So Rama, I'll start with you, patents. Right, a lot happening in the world of patents. What does that look like?
Thank you, Kirti, and thank you, CSIS and Leadership IP for including me on this perfect panel. As Dr. Parker noted, AI capabilities are growing exponentially by the day, at least by the week. And so these capabilities are providing better insights into a broader array of subject matter. They are providing new ways to use the AI. So for example, AI is being used in drug discovery. So for example, Novartis's Jaeger system was trained on over 21,000 proprietary molecules. It was seeded with 3 molecules and asked to provide new novel antimalarials. And it generated over 200 of these compounds, and they did work on it to see which ones had the characteristics they wanted, low cytotoxicity, and they did more experimentation, of course, and then went on with that. And Corey, if you're watching, I hope I got that right. But also, it's being used in antibody identification, so you can tell the AI, this is the target that I want an antibody for. And so it's been trained on what that target looks like, what its dimensions are, what its 3D dimensions are, and what kind of antibodies can bind to these targets. And it is doing this much better, faster than humans can because it is trained on more data. It understands a lot more than a human can or what a limited number of people in a lab can. And another example in the tech industry is chip design. So engineers have to design chip floors to see how the components are going to be placed to maximize space, power, wire length, et cetera. And AI is being leveraged for chip designing. So, and maybe not generative AI, but it's still the same AI architecture that enables generative AI, large language models. So what does this mean for patents? I think there's several issues that AI raises and challenges for intellectual property rights. One is subject matter eligibility. And I know it's been talked about a lot, but we know we have subject matter eligibility. I would call it a mess here in the United States. And it doesn't help for AI because software already is vulnerable to patent protection. And AI at a very high level, can be thought of as an abstract idea. So how are we going to protect AI as an invention of itself? But getting back to AI capabilities, a lot of people are using AI in the invention creation process, as I said. So when that happens, who is the inventor? So is it, our laws say that we can only have natural persons as inventors. So, but what does that mean? Who in that process, when I'm using AI, for example, in a wet lab, to give me suggestions on drugs or molecules that I should be exploring? So the USPTO did issue guidance on patent inventorship, and they said that AI-generated inventions are not categorically unpatentable. They did say that natural persons have to make a significant contribution to the invention to be able to qualify as an inventor. And then they provided, principles, and we can go into that later. And this, this is a great start. I do think that this means that there is other patent challenges. There's now a new patent challenge about, did a human make significant contribution when AI is used in an invention creation process? And I think this issue will come up during the patent examination process itself, but I think it'll also come up in litigation. I think this is a new hurdle to patentability and enforcement. I think obviousness is also an issue because when the use of AI in creating inventions becomes more commonplace, can you just say that it was obvious to use an AI to help you come up with this answer? I think enablement is an issue when AI is used in the invention creation process because, as Dr. Parker mentioned, we don't really know very well how these systems are working. So how can you explain that you own, you had written description or you own this, had this invention in mind? And then I think that AI can also generate prior art. You can push a button, give it ideas, say, generate prior art, put it into the public domain as a defensive mechanism. So I think there are a lot of issues that we're going to have to deal with. I call it job security for IP, the IP ecosystem. But I think there's also great measures. I think the USPTO guidance did a great job with the guidance, and they have said it's going to be an iterative process. So I think that we need to make sure that our IP system is sustainable, that it is, it is protected, so that these laws these guidance and these rules around patent inventorship and all these other issues that I just talked about don't undermine our patent regime.
Can you give us some, are there examples out there where these issues have been stress tested, where somebody applied for an AI-assisted patent, and how did the patent office react, and how did the courts react?
So in the guidance, the Patent Trademark Office gave two hypothetical examples. One was drug discovery, and when, for example, if a person just uses an AI model to ask for suggestions on which molecule should I start with, who is the inventor in that process? Is it, can it be the person who built the AI model? Can it be the person who prompted the AI model? Is it the person who got the output and did more work on the output to see if it was what was intended and will work as intended? Another example they gave was in the tech sector of finding, I believe it was an axle for a car and finding new material to use. So those are hypothetical examples, but I think we will see more real-world examples as time goes by.
Yeah. And let me, quickly turn to you, Phil. Same question, right? AI-assisted invention, but creation in the copyright space. What are we seeing, just on that question before we go to data and litigation, what are we seeing and how is that being handled right now?
Well, just like the patent office, the copyright office has also issued some guidance, and I'll talk in a little bit about the path by which we got to that guidance. But fundamentally, the Copyright Office has given some examples of things that would need to be disclosed and disclaimed because they're the unaltered products of generative AI and not the products of human authorship. Yeah. So, for example, using generative AI for ideation purposes or for a functioning thesaurus or to optimize for a particular audience. Copyright Office said that falls into the bucket of, in the copyright space, call this assistive AI. So this is something that is not really generating an expressive product that a human being otherwise would, but it's helping the human being in some way. And then for the generative aspects, you know, the market's changing daily, but we see text generation, image generation, code completion, multimodal systems coming out. So we see those all the time, and as those produce expressive works that a human artist would normally have to do, those are some issues that we end up having to deal with in terms of teasing apart the creative process and finding the human authorship in the process of creation.
And maybe we want to talk about this specific case that people might have heard in the news of a photographer taking a picture and translating it into a painting that was inspired by Van Gogh, and the Copyright Office denied application of...
Yeah. That's one of the later decisions that the Copyright Office had. And interestingly, that same applicant had applied for registration for a similar work or the same work in India and had gotten a registration preliminarily. This was Surrealist. And then it was later canceled in India. So in the United States, this was a particular model that was a bespoke model. I think he was an academic researcher, where you take an image from some source. In this case, it was Starry Night by Van Gogh. They took their own image, and then you can set the parameters for how much of each of the two contributions should be manifest in the output. And there the Copyright Office said, okay, there's not enough creativity here that we can source to the human operator. And so then, therefore, the application was denied.
So Lynn, going back to you. So between the spectrum of, you know, taking a picture and modifying it to R&D inventions in biotech and semiconductor chips, there's a spectrum. And the question that's asked is a broad one. When there is an invention that's AI-assisted, where in the spectrum are you going to draw the line of what's patentable or copyrightable and what's not? And it's a difficult question. And let me just, you know, sort of frame this for our conversation a little bit. It's not a new one, because we saw the same question in software in the past. And we know, actually, I would like to ask you this from a very technical perspective. How do we know, how do we define what's software and what's AI? And what's patentable and what's not? Doesn't this create a really tricky set of questions?
Well, AI is software. It's a special type of software. I think, you know, if you get a room full of people who are AI experts in a room and say, what is AI? You know, they're all going to have a different opinion.
Right.
Actually, there is a legislated definition of AI.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what new regulations and so forth are defaulting to.
Yeah.
But it's not particularly an operational definition.
And it's a moving target.
It's a moving target. And so I think there is certainly a challenge of saying this is AI. You know, when I was in the federal government and doing things like trying to scope out, just as an aside, things like how much is the United States spending on AI research and development, we also did it in a scoping statement of saying anything within this scope, it's up to the agency to decide what actually is AI. So I am not optimistic that we'll be able to have any sort of regulation or policy that definitively says this is in scope, that's out of scope. I think it's going to have to be, it's one of these cases you recognize it when you see it kind of thing. But, you know, I'm not really an expert on, you know, what would be patentable as it relates to the spectrum of software versus AI. I think when it comes to the human contribution, that is you know, at one end, if it's purely some AI out of the sky suddenly generates something, I think there's consistent opinion that is not patentable, obviously, because there's no human involved there. But where you draw how much human involvement is whether it has to do with software or AI. I think that's going to continue to be a challenge that I suppose is going to have to be determined on a case-by-case basis.
Are you concerned about this, Rama? Because when we saw this for software patents, for example, there were some big cases in the Supreme Court, and that led to this question of patent-eligible subject matter, what's patentable, what's not in software patents. And it was a tricky battle because, I've done a few empirical studies in the past, and I've seen that, first of all, what you define as any category of patents, software patents, yesterday, AI-assisted patents, today, is a changing definition. And it can be a really broad one, and it can implicate a lot of technologies that are critical for national security and making them often not patentable. Is that a concern you're facing?
I think that is a concern, right? I mean, just like that first panel said, innovation is really important in this global competition. IP's historically been a lever in fueling that innovation. So if the United States wants to be leaders in artificial intelligence and related technologies, we also need to be leading in our intellectual property rights to make sure that we are protecting them, to make sure that it is still being used as a lever for innovation. I looked up for other words for incentive during that first panel, but so it is the enticement, it is the motivation, it is what allows you to make those investments, which are sometimes incredibly burdensome. And so again, as that first panel said, it is especially important for the smaller, medium-sized players who have hurdles in getting into the marketplace, getting into the ecosystem. I agree that trade secrets is being used as an alternative to the patent system, but so is open source. I think open source is great for many reasons, democratizing access, et cetera. But we need a balance of intellectual property rights. It can't be just trade secrets and open source. There needs to be a place for a strong patent system for those who need it. Because the trade secret option as well as open source is not going to be an option for everybody. So we need this option for some people who really need the patent system as the enticement to make the necessary investments in resources, in money, especially for those technologies that are much longer term. And so it is a really upfront, heavy risk. All you have at that point are intellectual property right protections. So I do think it is very important. It's something that we really need to make sure we get right if we are going to lead in innovation.
Anything you want to add, Phil?
The same concerns apply for copyright, and I'll say that in general, the patent office and patent law has some built-in safeguards as well because they're technical, there's a long process, you need expert examiners and attorneys to represent you for the patent system. For copyright, there's an accessibility concern in that anybody can own a copyright. A child using an iPhone that has ChatGPT on it can say, give me a software program that will say hello world, a very simple closed universe of code that they could have. Is that copyrightable, is that not? Those narrow use cases might be some of the use cases that the Copyright Office sees more often in terms of generating images. But all the way up to huge code bases with millions of lines of code and armies of engineers and developers all over the world. These types of use cases and the issues that go along with the protectability of copyrightable works, and then what you need to subtract out, which we'll get into in the guidance in a moment, raises great concerns in terms of protectability and the ability to invest and leverage IP that you create.
So speaking of the word incentives, I think that's going to be today's word. Where's Patrick? But speaking of incentives, one of the issues that now we are dealing with in the copyright or the space is basically the use of content, data, and litigation in the copyright space as the use of the Gen AI models has taken off, which uses millions of data inputs, right? So there's a ton of litigation about whose content is it, potential copyright infringement, and the value of the content. So Phil, I would love to walk us down the litigation landscape today what are the key questions that are being asked right now?
Yeah. Well, I'll say from litigation standpoint, my team and I were tracking about 60 litigations that deal with AI or generative AI around the world. Most of that's happening in the United States, and most of that's happening in copyright. So I'll focus mostly on copyright.
60? 60?
60, yes, that's right. Depending on how you count. So, but we've seen, since the first cases were filed in the copyright space, a steady increase in the sophistication and focus of the claims. And so one of the big questions that we're seeing as a pattern is the parties and the judges are increasingly getting under the hood and disaggregating the process, looking at how things are being used, by whom, when in the process, and by role and by stage. So one of the key decisions that came out was a motion to dismiss decision in Anderson versus Stability. That's putative class action brought by an artist against Stability for an image generation AI. And one of the important things for that case when they went to court, there wasn't a clear distinction between which of the defendants did what. So one of the defendants was Stability, which was alleged to have been responsible for a company going out and assembling 5 billion images to train on. That's Leon. And then also they developed their own foundation model, and then also deployed their own model. And then as co-defendants in the case, there was DeviantArt, which was in-licensed Stability's foundation model, and then deployed its own model with Stability powering it. And then there was another entity, Midjourney, which was at least a deployer of something that relied on Stability. And then the judge said, I can't tell whether you're alleging that Midjourney also did some supplemental collection and some supplemental training on top of that, like fine-tuning is the term that we would use in the AI space there. And so the judge said, okay, I'm going to dismiss this. You have leave to amend. And one of the things that you need to do is more clearly articulate who you're saying did what in the process. And so that's one of the fundamental questions that we end up seeing a lot here is who did what and how do these things work under the hood. Another issue that came up with that is, right now anyway, or at least based on the time frame at issue, the way that deployers and end users of the generative AI models like Stability would have to work is they would have to submit a prompt, and then there would be access to a hosted version of the foundation model. And so one of the things that the judge said is, well, how does that implicate copyright? Because copyright requires a copy, requires a distribution. And so if you're only providing access to something that exists on a server, how can you say that at least the deployer defendants have done something that implicates a copyright right? And so there's leave to amend to address those issues as well. One of the big questions that has come up and that we do have some determinations on is a question of whether we call it the causal connection theory of copyright infringement is viable. And every court to address this so far has said no. So, and this is a theory that enabled a lot of the initial complaints in the copyright space, or at least they were based on. So in the Anderson case again, those plaintiffs said, we don't need to allege that the copyright that I own is substantially similar to the model or the outputs of the model, because they would rely on this idea that because there's an underlying instance of copyright infringement that was used in the collection and training of the model, then sort of a poison fruit analogy, everything that comes afterward that touches on that is necessarily an infringement. So they didn't even include a side-by-side in the first instance. And the judges have all said, who've addressed this issue anyway, have said, no, in order for there to be copyright infringement, you must show that there is a copy or substantial similarity. So the motion to dismiss was granted. They had the ability to come back, amend their complaint, and say, okay, here's some substantial similarity allegations. And they have supplemented that to a degree. I think those are some of the major issues that we're seeing now. Of course, we're seeing some previews of the fair use defense. We may get some early decisions on that as well. Particularly because there's an opposition to a preliminary injunction motion in one of the cases, so we might get an early indication with that. Otherwise, we're seeing some of the defendants fast forward to a fair use defense. mostly as atmospherics in some of their briefings of the motions to dismiss and other preliminary procedural mechanisms, but they're not the basis for the determination of the
So before we get to fair use, I just want to unpack this a little bit on the with the technology input here.
Sure.
So what you're basically saying is, I think it's for a sort of generally audience who's not tracking copyright litigation, which I am too, by the way, but this cartoon comes to mind where you have these, there are these artists and writers and painters and musicians that are fishing, and each one has a fishing rod and it's taking a fish, and whatever they catch, they're collecting it in a basket behind them together. And then there's another player who's wearing a jacket called Gen AI, who is putting the fishing rod in the basket with all the collected fish. So I think that basically draws the picture of what's happening. And then the question is, there's a lot of this content that is being used to train these models. There's a lot of input. So how do you determine, I think Phil has laid out how this is drawing out in litigation, and the question that is being now synthesized is, well, what specific training set did you use and how did that specifically relate to your output? But can we do that from a technical perspective? How hard or how easy is it to do that for?
So I think at a theoretical perspective, what you would like to do is say, here is a piece of input, and here's the way it weaves itself through this AI model, and here's where it kind of influenced an output. And theoretically, you could imagine maybe ways of using provenance or where data has come from, and tagging it in certain ways so that you can determine that. But you're looking at trillions of inputs, and there's not a direct, there's no copy of it within the model that's being built. What these generative AI models are doing are are looking statistically at these trillions of inputs and are coming up in ways that we don't fully understand, with incredibly complex models that are predictive of something that seems realistic. But nowhere in there can you find that input just kind of pasted. It's not doing a collage of things, for instance. And so I think the challenge is, can you do that kind of provenance checking through an AI model and do it in an efficient way? Not every input to the system actually influenced how the model ended up being formed, and then it may not have been used in terms of any particular output. So I think the challenge is always, you have inputs, they may or may not have ever influenced any sort of output, and being able to trace that through the system. Technically, you could sort of theoretically imagine how you would do it. I think from a practical perspective, it's not going to be easy. It's not easy to do that.
Rama, you were saying something?
Actually, I have a question. So if we can't technically have provenance to sort of connect the dots between how the input got into the model and to the output, are there other options, policy options that we should be thinking about?
Well, I think certainly transparency is always a good thing. And so in theory, if you want to say this is what was the input to the system, that's kind of a starting point. But I don't think it's a very satisfactory answer, because you therefore, as I just said, don't know how it was used. I think certain companies are exploring only using licensed data. I think Adobe is one that only uses licensed data. I think the challenge you run into that is that by definition you're going to be restricted to the data that you use. And now we have this this duel between, you want to reduce bias, and the way you often reduce bias is by having more input. Bias typically happens because you don't have enough data about sort of small or sort of outlier cases, or what often in the technical terms is called small class versus large class, meaning the majority of your data is about one thing, but you have some data that's very important, but you don't have as much of it. And so what you're trading off, I think, if you only use approved licensed data, is that now you're more likely to end up with some sort of biased results because you don't have the broad spectrum of input. So I think achieving both policy goals at the same time is not immediately straightforward.
In the copyright litigations, at least, there's allegations about how you can derive some of the training materials from either the model or the outputs. And so one research paper by a Google engineer named Carlini has been cited over and over again in the complaints. And basically that research paper says, for image generation anyway, that his team of engineers could go into image generation model and using certain techniques, so not using it for the outputs, but just go to the model, derive some of the original source material that they have, about 100 or 200 instances of images that they could say they could get from backforming. And so one of the things that the Anderson plaintiffs did when they had their motion, after the motion to dismiss to amend, they amended their complaint to add additional citations to this article, plus other research that says, okay, there is some possibility that the model itself has memorization. Sort of the counterpoint to that this is just weights and biases, which is what some of the developers might say, would be on the other side that this is a sophisticated and probabilistic compression algorithm that you might say 99% of the time this word is followed by that word, or 100% of the time this word is followed by that word. Relatedly, then, the second way that people have been trying to divine whether certain things were used was by consulting the outputs. So in the Concord versus Anthropic case, these are music companies that have sued Anthropic over lyrics. And they said, okay, give me the lyrics to Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And then on output, the entire set of lyrics for the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air came out. And then they would say, okay, give me the lyrics to a song about somebody moving from West Philadelphia to California in the 90s. And they gave the lyrics to Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, more or less. And so if it was really just probabilistic, and it was really just weights and biases, then you might get a bunch of lyrics that surprise and delight you in various ways, but are not exactly 100% the lyrics to Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. So the story goes. And then the last way, especially for smaller models like you had mentioned, there are ways of attaching provenance, but mainly that's for where you've implemented the generative AI technology in a particular way in the deployed use case. So you would have a foundation model, which basically is understanding language or whatever the modality is that you want. Then you might have a set of inputs, and those inputs might exist in a freestanding database that gets consulted, or it may be the user adds inputs into the prompt material. And those things, there might be ways that people are looking at to say, okay, this is what I'm going to use as part of the output. The generative AI will say that, and then include a citation to a particular set of things that were used and incorporated into the output. Things like reports and things like that.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges sometimes is that these models are just, they're sort of reading the internet, right? And so they're getting information that's off of a page at a URL at a certain point in time. But, what's on that page the next day may be different. And so keeping track of how all of these things are, at the moment that you accessed it, what did the page look like, effectively could mean that you have to reproduce the internet at a moment in time all over again. And so the technical viability of that's pretty low.
Yeah, and because you're saying, trillions of inputs, probabilistic models, and there is this question about fair use, if input is being used for training these models, is this copyright infringement or not? Is there a question of valuation that occurs? And I think, Phil, I would like to ask you a little bit about the music industry. You've been involved in the music industry, licensing litigation for a long time. Eventually, they came up with business models, licensing models to aggregate content and to be able to license it. Is that a sensible possibility? Is that happening? And if it does, the analogy only goes so far because valuation. How do you place a value on different kinds of content when there is so much input that is being fed to train these models? What's your read on that?
Yeah, and there's a really interesting evolution of the discourse here. So I'm going to the older examples you're talking about here. In the Copyright Office's process of listening sessions, they had 4 sets of listening sessions with stakeholders who came in, including from some of the major record labels and publishers, as well as other industries. And those representatives basically said, this isn't like piracy, online piracy. What we want to do here is find a way forward. We're not trying to shut this down. We want to find the right way for credit and compensation. And so they're finding a path forward. And that's a useful data point. During those conversations, the rights owner said, we want to license these things. We want a free market solution to this. And they reported that when they had those discussions, the answer on the developer side was, this is fair use. So you can get a license, but that license value is 0 because it's not infringing. Today, there is content being licensed for the development of AI. The question really is, how useful is that and for what use cases? Because in some instances, you need to train on lots of things, a huge amount of things. In other cases, you need less, depending on what your objectives are. But my team, for example, we are doing content licensing for AI uses in training and as inputs and supplemental inputs and various other use cases as well for music and print and everything else under the sun.
So that's happening.
It is happening, yeah.
Rama, you were saying something?
Nope. I did want to comment on data, if that's okay.
Yeah, I was exactly getting to that. You know, data is a critical input to AI. What are other countries, what are the big issues there and what other countries are doing?
So aside from copyrightable data, there's data that's really critical to AI, especially in the healthcare space, drug discovery space, curating really big quality data sets that are so important and critical to some of these models, or even creating synthetic data when the real data isn't going to work for whatever purposes, bias, privacy issues, et cetera. What are the incentives to create those types of data sets? We don't have data property rights other than the copyrightable data here in the United States. China, back in 2021, when the National Security Commission on AI issued its final report, it included recommendations to strengthen the United States IP system, especially when China is making IP a priority in its national strategies and strengthening its policies and IP policies and strategies. And one of the recommendations there was that we should explore data intellectual property rights, what that would look like, why we need them, and so on. And that was in spring of 2021. By the end of 2021, there was reports that China was exploring pilot projects for data and intellectual property rights across its innovation hubs. And this year, I've seen news that China's intellectual property office has taken up the effort to see if data and intellectual property rights would create necessary markets for data. So I think that is something that we should explore here, especially perhaps in certain sectors like healthcare diagnosis, drug discovery, to see how we can democratize access to data so that big quality data sets, synthetic data, et cetera, is not just sitting in a few companies. How can we get that data? How can we create those protections and motivations to democratize that data to other smaller players who may be able to help fuel the innovation ecosystem? I think that is
a really
something,
good point, yeah. And speaking about what other countries are doing, I just want to go back to this broader question about, I think Cal Goldman raised the point about none of this can be done unilaterally. We need international cooperation. And in terms of, taking a step back from the IP angle of AI, writ large, like a lot of countries are looking at artificial intelligence. They're looking at the implications for policy and regulation. I have this data point from Jim Lewis, who sits here at CSIS. He wrote that there are 37 different AI-related laws passed in 127 different countries in 2023 alone. They're asking and answering a lot of questions, granted, not just related to IP, right, on safety and security and bias and so on. But it really raises the question about this international patchwork of laws and regulation and how to navigate that. Is there a role for the United States here? What are we doing? What can we do? I would like to ask that question to all of you.
I'm happy to start. I think as the previous panel mentioned, maybe thinking about it in terms of regulatory regimes that harmonize with each other as opposed to a single global regulatory regime, I think is kind of a realistic goal. Going back to 2019, when the OECD countries, certainly led by the United States, agreed to a set of principles about the appropriate stewardship of trustworthy AI. I think those principles, now they're 5 years old, but they're the overarching perspective on how to use AI in a responsible way. I think most of the world agrees, and certainly in the United States, I think there is a strong bipartisan, bicameral perspective on what those policies ought to be, what the characteristics are of AI and the trustworthy use of AI. I think when it comes to taking those and turning them into regulations, it's going to be different, I think, for different regulatory regimes, almost by definition. I think one super important advantage that the United States has in that regard is that we already have lots of agencies that have regulatory authorities over particular use cases, like FDA in healthcare or DOT in the transportation space and so forth. And those are the agencies that can dig in and think about what are the use cases that are high risk. And this is then be harmonious with what the EU is doing with a risk-based approach, meaning you don't have the same regulatory oversight of use cases that are low risk in terms of impacts on people or safety and security, national security, versus those that have a high risk, or even some use cases that you might want to prohibit altogether. And so I think certainly with the most recent executive order from back in October, I think there's progress in pushing those agencies that have regulatory authorities to actually come out with the guidance so that we can have sort of a US-based approach to defining what that regulation should look like in AI that's consistent with our regulatory setup, which is not the same as what the EU has. But I think the overarching principles of safety and security and fairness and so forth are the same. So I'm somewhat optimistic that we can come up with harmonious regulations eventually.
Emma, you want to?
Sure. I completely agree. I mean, I would say the U.S. is leading right now, but not by much in AI and other technologies. But we need to make sure that we sustain that lead, and we can't do that without our partners and allies. And to be able to have data flows, trade agreements, et cetera, we do need harmony in our regulations. I did want to make one point to Dr. Parker's recognition that the EU is using a risk-based approach. The United States doesn't have a risk-based approach, and what would one look like? So the Special Competitive Studies Project did issue a framework for identifying highly consequential AI use case, whether that's beneficial or harmful. What does that look like? So the EU AI Act only concentrates on risks. But here in the United States, we want to harness the benefits of these technologies. That's why we are interested in innovation. So how do we get that balance between regulation and innovation? And one way to do that is to really focus our regulatory efforts on those AI use cases that's going to have the most significant impacts on our society. Again, whether that's beneficial or harmful. So what does that look like? We had the framework that SCSP issued lays out the different categories of benefits and harms and identifies specific harms and benefits in each, and has a way of assessing sort of a heat map of, what kind of impact is this going to have on society. So I do think the United States also needs a risk-based approach or some sort of highly consequential-based approach. And so I think that's where some of our efforts should focus as well.
Yeah. Could you have something to say about this?
Yeah, on the international comparative front, to say that the U.S. Copyright Office has been taking comments and having listening sessions and having webinars about international aspects of IP for the purposes of considering harmonization. I'll say that other countries have had final determinations, or at least preliminarily at the lower court level pending appeals. So there was a decision in the Czech Republic last week dealing with ownership and infringement claims for AI-generated images. China has at least a handful of decisions dealing with ownership of generative AI outputs, and also one infringement case as well. And so the United States, we are in the process of litigating some of these issues, but it's going to be a long time until the litigations finish. There's policies that are happening now that people are trying to organize around, but to the extent that it takes a while to get to our final determinations on what the copyright regime should be in the United States, other countries are also setting a bar that, if we harmonize too, may answer the question for us before we get there.
So, it's, as you guys are saying this, I think these are the technology. It's such a large scale it's changing everything. So it really has an impact on the word of the day, incentives, and how we are going to innovate and create into the future. So any of these IP policies around AI will have sort of these long-term and rippling effects through society. That's why they matter in this grayscale area. With that, let me just open the floor to questions and comments, participation from our room here, and we'll get back to the panelists. It's a new technology. Any questions? A good question. We have a couple here.
Well, I do not have a question, but I just have a comment, because at the beginning it was said that it's difficult to define AI because things are changing. But I think that we can talk about two definitions for the general public. I will say, somebody asked me what is AI. I would say, in general, it is the attempt to translate some elements of human intelligence into computer terms. That's it. Now, somebody said, no, technical. Okay, it's math plus data equal algorithm plus training to get a software plus a final decision making. That's AI. The grouping of math, data, training to get something that you, as the creator, want AI to do. That's it. So simple.
So let me comment on that. Oh yes, not everyone heard the question.
It was not a question, it was a comment.
It was a comment, yes. The comment, she was suggesting that maybe there is a definition of AI that's math and data and algorithms, training, and it's doing something that is traditionally you think would require human intelligence. And I think most people would sort of loosely agree with that. But let me give kind of a bit of a counterexample to focus our attention on what the goal is. What's the goal of defining AI? And I think in many of the regulatory conversations, the goal is more about making sure that people aren't harmed by the technology in some cases. And so I had the opportunity to testify before the Senate Homeland HSGAC, Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee a few months ago. And another person another witness was a fellow that used to be ACLU representative in Idaho. And he had been litigating for a very long time harms that were caused to an individual whose some social benefits that they were planning, had been getting, had been reduced by a substantial amount, and they were told your benefits are going down, and they wanted to know why. And they asked the office, the government office, why are my benefits going down? And they said, well, just because. I'm paraphrasing it, and they kept going back, and well, why are they going down? And eventually it got to the point where it was a formula in an Excel spreadsheet that nobody understood. And so everyone in the office was saying this formula says so. I'm paraphrasing again, but the gist is it was an Excel formula that the vast majority of us would say that's not AI, but it was being used to make decisions about people's access to resources that was harming them. And so I think, and when you're thinking about regulatory challenges and what it is you want to regulate about, it's any kind of sort of automated decision-making that is potentially impacting people in a negative way, whether it's an Excel formula or something that is more like a neural net. And so I think that's why for academic purposes, you know, you might want to come up with a definition, and certainly in legislation there is a definition. But at the end of the day, if the goal is to minimize the impacts of technology on people as it relates to things like access to resources, we have to be sure that we're not scoping out things that have exactly the same impact, even though we may not call them AI. So it's kind of a complicated territory when you couple it with the regulatory goals.
Very interesting.
Thank you for a fascinating, very interesting discussion. But you have been using copyright and patent sort of flowing back and forth. But the two regimes are very different, and all the economics of innovation tell you that they have very different ways of affecting the incentives, since you mentioned. So could you unpack that? But the second part to that is, even in copyright, we've been talking about data and other parts of copyright, let's say, of coding, let's say. Well, can you copyright codes? Because 90% of people use Copilot, or 99% of software developers, people working on AI, are using that. That becomes another issue, because copywriting data it's much more in the news because of the news media. But from an innovation point of view, perhaps the problem with Copilot will be a bigger one in terms of Lastly with that, in terms of copyright, you know, the Andy Warhol case, the use case versus the transformative, that raises very fundamental questions. And that changes the valuation of different parts. So I think it would be useful to unpack these in terms of understanding what the economic impact is. Because I think the reason the Chinese have gone further ahead in terms of getting their arms around this complex subject is they have not let it be tied into the sort of legal technicalities, but have taken the bigger picture and then seen where are the bottlenecks. Don't you think we need to do that ourselves?
So I think the biggest inconsistencies, and would love your thoughts on this, between current patent law and copyright law is just the patentability of AI-generated inventions. It's not categorically unpatentable, whereas I wonder if the copyright approach is a little inconsistent with that, and maybe if it is, there's good reason for it, given the economic and policy reasons between the Patent Act and the Copyright Act. But I do think that's something we should address, because we don't want any inconsistencies to undermine the IP regime as a whole.
Yeah, fundamentally, in the copyright space, we have questions of ownership, and then we have questions of the outputs. And so there's a lot to unpack in your great question there. But one of the big fundamental differences between patent and copyright is that a copyright infringement is implicated from the moment it's used. It happens, the moment a copy is made, the moment the distribution is made, the moment a public performance is made. Whereas an infringement for patent, you have to practice the patent somehow without authorization. And so that gets into different regimes, because maybe an AI produces the description of what the patent is, but somebody still has to put that into practice, right? Whereas a copyright infringement may occur just from the moment that something is copied into a training set, or is latent within a model, or is produced on output. It doesn't require the additional step of putting it into practice in the industry or the marketplace. Similar with trademark. Trademark has to be used in the marketplace to identify a good or service, and so you have this air gap between the model and the ultimate use case.
Yeah, I have neither a question nor a comment, but I would like to brainstorm just a bit. One of the general themes that I've noticed in this panel discussion is the difficulty of distinguishing the human inspiration from the artificial intelligence inspiration. And I feel like much of this could be addressed if we incentivize both a centralized artificial intelligence model and a local artificial intelligence assistance. And what I mean by local is unique to each individual user's device, a independently encapsulated artificial intelligence assistance. And what this centralized and localized distinction will be able to do is form a relationship with the human actor. So the local AI can serve as an activist for the human that it represents, and can negotiate with the centralized artificial intelligence model. And having established that personalized relationship at the local level, then we can address if the inspiration actually came from that individual person versus, was this inspired from some centralized collection of inputs? Just brainstorming an idea there. Thank you.
Using AI to solve the question of identifying who the inventor was.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one because I'm not sure size matters in determining how much the AI has contributed versus the human has contributed in that spectrum. I do think that's where the future is headed, where we're all going to have some sort of AI-enabled assistant. I think that maybe your point might be that it is easier to sort of define what the human contribution is in those localized AIs as opposed to sort of the centralized AI. I think philosophically, we really need to be empowering the humans to make sure that the humans are controlling the AI as well as those. You can't incentivize AI, you can only incentivize humans. So we need to make sure that any sort of intellectual property rights are inured towards humans. But yeah, I would have to give that some more thought.
I think in general, for all of these issues, the devil is in the details,
Yeah.
and you get taxed on what you don't know. And so that makes it a little bit difficult as well. I guess another bumper sticker that you might throw out here is AI. Is it both the problem and solution to all of the problems that we have now?
Yeah.
So maybe that's one way of doing it. But going to the question of whether you can have a local instance sort of mediate the interaction with a larger instance, some touch points for that might be in the U.S. Copyright Office. They rejected an application where somebody had said, I, myself, a human being, used more than 600 successive prompts to an image generation AI. So isn't that enough human creation, those 640 some odd prompts? And the Copyright Office said, no, it's not, and rejected the application. And then the Czech Republic decision that came out last week, as I had mentioned, that prompt was something along the lines of, give me an image of people signing a contract in a boardroom showing only their hands. And the court there said that prompt in and of itself isn't enough. So you go in, you see what the prompt is, and if you have the records of the prompt, then you can see, well, does this have enough expression in it or not? You'd have to have those, and then you'd also have to be able to tease apart, especially when things become much more complicated. And then maybe even you have AI mediating the prompts as you put in sort of a human-generated prompt, and then it interprets it into better instructions that feed the prompt as well.
That's coming too.
Yeah, and I just one observation. I think, the last 5 years of AI development have shown us that we have to think dual use or triple use. And so that would require, I think, some research and development to create that kind of capability. And then I think, well, what else could it be used for? And I think it could also be used for an employer to see how much work your employee is actually doing. So, you get into these gray zones of, do you really want to go down that road of having an AI system that kind of tattles in some sense on what the human is actually doing in sort of a dual use kind of perspective. So I think we just have to kind of think through the ways that these kinds of developments can be used in a harmful way as well.
So you have the unfortunate task of being the panel between everybody and lunch. So I'll maybe finish by what Walt said, a quick fire drill with a quick takeaway key questions we are facing today. Phil, let's start with you.
Okay, so in general, for the policy standpoints, I think it's important to develop a shared vocabulary. I think that's one of the themes that came out today and that some of the regulators have been grappling with. What is AI? What are the AI uses? What are the modalities? Like I said, you get taxed on what you don't know, and so it's important for people to have these conversations, dig deeper into what people are using, with the Copyright Office and the Patent and Trademark Office taking comments from interested stakeholders participating and figuring out the way forward, because the Copyright Office and the other regulators can only regulate about what they know. And so you have to bring the use cases, the business cases, the real stakes to their attention so that they can craft regulations that apply and actually matter in the marketplace. And then I'll say that there is, in the United States, maybe as the industry is moving very, very fast, some people may think it's a very slow process, and indeed it is a slow process here. One of the things that people are trying to do here is ensure that all of the developments that we have are future-proofed, that whatever we decide today doesn't hurt us 20 years from now. And so those are some of the interests at stake here.
And I'll put it very simply, but I know it's much more complicated than that. But I think we need regulations and laws that harness the benefits of our AI technologies and fuel our innovation so that it's serving humans and society. What that looks like, it's complicated because there's a lot of issues, IP, copyright, responsible AI. But I think that's what we should be striving towards.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, I'm a technology optimist. I think technology can be used to solve so many tough challenges. And I don't want us to be so concerned about some of the potential harms that we end up sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. And just one final little point that we haven't touched on today is making sure that as we think about these technologies and look at it kind of in an innovation forward perspective, that we don't necessarily hold AI to a higher standard than we do the human-based systems. I know a lot of conversations around bias in AI, but also some of these copyright issues are trying to hold AI to a standard of perfection. That means that we can't use it, even though it probably would be better than a human system would be. So I think we have to keep that in mind as we try to come up with the right pathway forward.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, these issues are playing out in the real time. So I think maybe when we, and by the way, at CSIS with SCSP, we've been doing regular roundtables on these specific topics. So if you are following it, you're interested, shoot us an email. We would love to hear from you, discuss with you. But I think we have to come back. We have to come back to this topic. So with that, maybe we say thank you to our panelists here. We break for lunch, and after lunch, we'll reconvene at, I think it's 1 o'clock, 1:15. Very good, thank you. And we will go straight into the future and problem-solving mode with some excellent panels lined up. Thank you all.